Hello, welcome to my channel. I am both supportive and critical of Jordan Peterson. I would call myself a fan actually, but at the same time I think I could be described pretty well as a postmodern neo-Marxist, albeit sort of a right-wing postmodern neo-Marxist. But I'm a graduate student who studies this stuff, and I've actually been highly influenced by a lot of these figures like Foucault, who are anathema for Jordan. So I think there's room for healthy criticism and dialogue, and I actually think that Jordan would be happy to discuss this stuff. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the criticism I hear of Jordan Peterson are is utterly ridiculous. On rare occasions, some of them I think sort of touch on serious issues. None that I've heard or read are particularly illuminating. The most interesting criticism that I've seen has come from an article I was forwarded by an anti-Peterson friend called Postmodernism Did Not Take Place on Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life by Shuja Haider. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Although this article would be much better and easier to take seriously if it didn't also include some ridiculous attacks, such as trying to connect Jordan Peterson to people like Anders Breivik and other lunatics who understand cultural Marxism in a very conspiratorial terms and seem to believe that this academic discourse is some kind of cunning Jewish plot to somehow overthrow America with infectiously hollow academic mumbo-jumbo. Yes, I would agree that neo-Marxism and cultural Marxism are roughly equivalent, but I think Jordan uses the latter term instead specifically to try and distance himself from these fringe figures. And certainly I've seen no indication that Jordan subscribes to a conspiracy theory of that sort, or or suggesting, as they do, that because Jordan Peterson is a big fan of Jung, he must be a wacko because Jung is a discredited mystical quack. To refute this, take a look at something like PepWeb, which is the main psychoanalytic peer-reviewed database used for research in the field. When I did, I counted up the citations just for that year and found that Jung was cited 70 times. For comparison, Lacan was cited 110 times, and he's the most important thinker in the tradition aside from Freud. So no, Jung is not a discredited quack. But aside from complaints like these, I think there's some value in the article, and it's at least a start, an attempt to engage with some of Jordan's thought at a deeper level. A lot of the article is informative and serious. If Jordan Peterson was pulled out of it entirely, it could be maybe turned into a pretty solid essay, especially if, for example, pulling Jordan Peterson out of the article meant that some of the sillier arguments that I'm assuming were ventured despite the author knowing they were silly, just because Jordan needs to be contested, were to disappear. Like if Derrida doesn't use the term postmodern, he must not be postmodern. There is no academic on the planet who would seriously suggest something like that. Or they're deliberately confusing dogmatic Marxism and cultural or neo-Marxism. Yeah, Marxism is a modernist project. Marx is essentially a structuralist. So all postmodern thinkers will have to either reject his thought in toto or sort of post-structuralize it. Jordan's preferred moniker of postmodern neo-Marxism is obviously an assertion that this group of thinkers and the movement he's referring to has opted for the latter. I've heard Jordan say these figures sneak Marxism in the back door, which I think is a bad way of putting it, but importantly, Jordan clearly does identify a conflict here. I've seen him repeatedly state that postmodern philosophy and Marxism are incompatible. So claiming that the two are incompatible in a critique of Jordan isn't really very effective, to say the least. Now, to begin, who are these people? Well, at first, I think it's important to distinguish between postmodernity as a situation and a historical period on the one hand, and postmodern philosophy on the other. This distinction is insufficiently maintained by people who criticize Jordan, and I also think it's insufficiently maintained by him. But more than this, and I think this is a big problem with the way people try to criticize him, I don't think it matters whether Derrida, say, is vulnerable to any particular criticism leveled against postmodern neo-Marxism by Jordan. What matters is whether the heirs of Derrida, the academic establishment, etc., is vulnerable to it. He isn't trying to engage with and criticize Foucault. He's addressing the way that Foucault animates a particular discourse today and how he is received and his legacy is taken up, absorbed, and is carried on. What he's addressing is this sort of academic holy trinity, critical theory along with Foucault and Derrida. The Frankfurt School is the most overtly or explicitly Marxist or neo-Marxist, and that's what critical theory is, but it's the least postmodern. Derrida is the most postmodern, but the least overtly Marxist. Foucault is sort of in the middle on both counts. I'm trying to be fairly quick, but I'm going to address these three areas a bit and try to explain why Jordan's description of them is perfectly acceptable. We'll begin at the beginning with critical theory in the Frankfurt School. Jordan Peterson argues that all of this began when it became clear to all these Marxist communist sympathizing intellectuals that the experiment was a catastrophe and a brutal failure, so they had to come up with a story about why it had failed. Now, I think that description is fine, except that the Frankfurt School really at least started out trying to grapple with the emergence of fascism, rather than reckoning with the failure of communism in the Soviet Union, although certainly the latter would become a major concern for them as well. I think the snuck in the back door stuff is a wrong way of putting it in general, but critical theory, which is the school of thought most associated with cultural Marxism and is what the Frankfurt School gives birth to, is at the core here. And I think they are adequately described by the moniker of cultural Marxism or Neo-Marxism if we divorce that term from any kind of conspiracy theory. But they weren't postmoderns who, for lack of any philosophical foundation permitting of real involvement in the world of concern or political projects, then decided to sneak Marxism into their philosophy. They, as Jordan at other times say, did try to figure out why communism was a failure, and also how people were suckered in by the fascists, but surely that's something you'd expect them to do. It's something they should do. If you advance a political agenda and it fails, you try to understand why. You don't throw up your hands and say, okay, I guess capitalism is the best or something. First of all, even if we could say that history showed that Marx was prescriptively wrong because the implementation of his ideas was a catastrophe, that wouldn't necessarily mean he was descriptively wrong. In other words, if his analysis of communism as a solution to the problems of capitalism turned out to be no solution at all, that doesn't mean that there are no problems of capitalism. And there certainly are problems. Jordan readily admits such. Now, Jordan believes that pain, suffering, misery, etc. is simply part of the human condition. One might ask how it is to be determined how much and which bits are unnecessary, which can be ameliorated, and how much and which bits are existential. But I don't know what he'd say in response. No one asks him. Regardless, the thinkers of the Frankfurt School who were reacting to this failure were shocked by the events of the 20th century. And this shock engendered in them, and in the academic intellectual world generally, a real skepticism about grand narratives. These events are key experiences in generating postmodern philosophy. And yes, the Frankfurt School, as well as everyone else Jordan is talking about, does share this skepticism about grand narratives, which is what Lyotard views as the core of postmodern thought, as correctly asserted by the article. I'll go into the topic of critical theory in the Frankfurt School in more detail in a different video, but suffice it to say that part of their solution to this problem was to think more deeply about Marxist ideas like ideology and false consciousness. They saw themselves as carrying on in the vein of Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, which said philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. Or as Horkheimer put it, their purpose was to liberate human beings from the circumstances enslaving them. So they were certainly concerned in the vein of Marx with the project of emancipating people from the circumstances of Western liberal democratic capitalism. They were influenced in this project by Weber's critique of Marx and his dialectical materialism, in which Weber had argued in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism against the idea that the base determines the superstructure. Contrarily, Weber argued that the development of Protestant Christianity and certain ideas within it, particularly are ideas like personal salvation, having to guard against the constant threat of sinfulness, predestination, etc., was the engine that drove the modern development of capitalism. In other words, the superstructure determined the base. They saw a way to reconcile this with Marx through the concepts of false consciousness and ideology. They basically saw bourgeois ideological mystification and false bourgeois consciousness as having been responsible for the Soviet failure. So they shifted their focus onto culture and what they call the culture industry. The idea here is that people's relation to reality is mediated by ideology. So Marxist critiques become immanent cultural criticism. They focus on ideological analysis and critique as opposed to more strictly economic analysis, viewing the perpetuation of the consciousness of mass man or one-dimensional man as the most serious, insidious obstacle to the people's emancipation. So Derrida really hits it big with his speech and essay called Structure, Sign, and Play. in which he really deals a serious blow to structuralism, which at the time was really popular in the universities. He delivered this in the mid-60s, I think 1966, at Johns Hopkins University. It sent shockwaves throughout academia and is really formative for the way the humanities and social sciences are understood and interpreted to this day. So in Structure, Sign, and Play, Derrida basically deconstructs Levi-Strauss's culture and nature signifier opposition, specifically regarding the incest taboo. Levi-Strauss argued that it was natural or structural because it was a human universal. Derrida wanted to suggest that its status as a taboo, however, necessarily implicates a cultural basis. He undermines the binary opposition altogether in a way characteristic of deconstruction in general, and he aims to show that these signifiers slide around. There's play, to use his terminology, and this makes it what he'll call later in Plato's Pharmacy an undecidable, which is to say that it isn't either nature or culture, it's both nature and culture, neither nature nor culture. The reason for this is that in postmodernity, the transcendental signified is understood to be absent. The God, say, that guarantees the ontological status of everything, to which all signifiers ultimately refer, is dead. It's an absent center, and so we have no means of deciding on the boundary between nature and culture. These signifiers have nothing to ground them. Part of what he's doing is playing on Heidegger's analysis of presence and absence, of presence as being the way being has been understood, basically at least since Plato. Heidegger instead tries to think fluidity, withdrawal, unconcealment, concealment, etc. The present center, being understood as presence of old, has for Derrida itself withdrawn. In the age of the macrosphere, there was little room for play. The movement was finite. Deferral, resignification, all of these things were limited. But now in postmodernity, they're all let loose. Systems of meaning are decoupled from the ground. Traditionally, semiotic chaos was warded off by a strong connection to God as the center or the transcendental signified. There was a sign regime in place that prevented the signifiers from sliding around infinitely. Derrida, as postmodern, represents a kind of infinitism, where now, since the signifiers are not rigidly bound to a center guaranteeing their ontological status, they drift, they slide. Peterson's argument is that they drift and slide right into the oblivion of nothingness, of ultimate meaninglessness. But the point is that Derrida, in announcing the death of structuralism, is also firmly announcing the death of the metaphysical age. Signifiers now, in play, can signify an infinity of different significations. The meaning of every signifier is always deferred. There's an infinite deferral of meaning. This is why the author's interpretation of the saying that there is nothing outside of the text, contra Jordan, is wrong. The author says he's not saying there are no birds or whatever. Well, that's true, except that what a bird is, what is, etc., in Derrida can never be a settled question. Even if he isn't denying that there is some ultimate reality out there somewhere, he is denying that we can ever ultimately know or even say anything about it. That we can't even say what we mean, actually. The saying about nothing being outside of the text means both, then, that you can't predicate anything of a text that isn't there already, and that everything that can be predicated of a text is already there. The text contains the whole world and is bounded by nothingness. The world is a text, and there is nothing outside of it. The book is not separate from it, and the world is not separate from the book, which of course is to say that there isn't any interpretation that can't be made of it, which is what Jordan Peterson says. And he understands correctly, I think, that if the world is detached from any ultimate meaning, the result of that is nihilism. Man just floats about in a semiotic chaos of endlessly proliferating signifierization, and the quest for meaning becomes ultimately an impossibility. He is arguing that this postmodern condition is connected to the general malaise we are experiencing in our age of epistemological and ontological collapse. It is true, as the author of the article says, and as he quotes Derrida as saying, in order for us to be able to get along at all, there has to be a center. In order for there to be any structure as the ground for the intelligibility of anything, there must be a center. But, crucially for Derrida, the center is an absent center. It's contentless, a gap or a void around which a structure develops. This gap is like difference. So for Levi-Strauss and the structuralists, words are differentially defined. But for Derrida, the meaning of them in this chain of differentially defined signifiers is endlessly deferred. You don't ever ultimately land anywhere solid. The terms change over time, metaphors sediment, we forget that they're metaphors at all, etc. While signifiers are differentially defined and get their meaning from the movement of difference, all of these conceptual binaries in the sort of traditional metaphysical paradigm are actually hierarchically conceived, such that one of the two in the pair is given dominance or primacy, and the other is subordinated to it, like in the speech and writing pair that's the subject of Derrida's magnum opus of grammatology. Traditionally, speech was privileged because the speaker, as center, as author of the words, is present. He's there to give meaning to the words, to explain them, to definitively say this or that means this or that, etc. Whereas in writing, he's absent. You're left to fend for yourself. But Derrida in his deconstruction overturns this traditional hierarchical structure. He says that actually writing is primary, and in speech, this idea that you can get the truth from the speaker, or that the speaker even knows what he means in the first place, is just an illusion. And yeah, he doesn't necessarily think these privileged traditional hierarchies are wrong necessarily. He thinks that the structure requires and invariably produces these kinds of hierarchical relationships, something which might be fruitful common ground to talk to Jordan Peterson about, as he also seems to think that hierarchy is a consequence of any kind of structural imposition. In deconstruction, Derrida wants to make transparent this fact, these operations, but he ultimately recognizes that for signifiers to signify anything in a structure, and some kind of center is demanded. What Jordan seems to be onto here is the idea that in the deconstructive movement, what's being indicated and accomplished, especially given the absence of a transcendental signified, is that the hierarchy of the oppositional conceptual pairings is undermined, shown to be contingent, even a confusion, even parasitic. It demonstrates that whatever is being signified is signified on the basis of some hierarchical conceptual domination. This signification, or meaning, is both seen as sort of arbitrary or transitory, and as a kind of domination or repression. The goal of deconstruction, then, already appears to be something like a return of the repressed. And in Spectres of Marx, for example, he does refer to deconstruction as being something like a continuation of Marxism. Interestingly, this article begins with the same line that Spectres of Marx begins with the same line that the Communist Manifesto begins with, as if to suggest sort of subliminally that they know that it's a Marxist tract. And in Spectres of Marx, for example, he does seem to refer to deconstruction as being something like a continuation of Marxism, a book the title of which surely is alone enough to qualify Derrida as being something like a neo-Marxist. Not to mention the Hamlet theme, in which Derrida is talking about the spirit of Marx that still animates us, still needs to be dealt with, interacted with, carried on in some way. The death of Marx as being something we must mourn properly and take up the mantle of Marx's messianism, which is, as Derrida says, the part of Marx he'd never be able to give up for ourselves. As Hamlet finally kills the usurper Claudius and becomes king for a moment, before dying and naming his successor to be Fortinbras. If you needed more, and to see how it's connected to the current political, cultural zeitgeist, just read White Mythology. In this popular essay, Derrida argues that the Western philosophical tradition is a white mythology. He likens it to the effacement of coinage, like taking an Athenian gold coin, which is regional, particular, situated within a particular economic context, and then rubbing Athena's image out, and in so doing proclaim that it's universal coinage. It's just gold, just a gold coin, and so universal, applying everywhere. It's the money of the world. This is what philosophy, particularly the white male, Western, European philosophical tradition is. It feigns universality, but it is simply the local idiom and metaphor effaced and being treated as universal. We pretend it's objective, true, right, that this is the story of metaphysics and reason in general, but that this gesture merely takes white male Western European reason to be the reason, the truth. We ignore the historical contingency of these metaphors. It is other traditions which are local, particular, provincial, historically contingent. Ironically, this is how the people Jordan Peterson is attacking still act. They treat tolerant, multicultural, rights-based, individualist, democratic values as universal. Or, for example, to argue that white people are the only ones who can't be culturally appropriated, or who can't be racist, etc. This is still to play the game Derrida is criticizing, treating white people as the universal category, as in, it is precisely a discourse that marginalizes non-whites, ironically, in its attempt to do the opposite. But anyway, so we elevate our provincialisms to the status of universality and objectivity, to reason, whereas other traditions are unreason. It is the status of the West, and the US in particular as global hegemon, that sort of allows for and reinforces this counterfeit. So then it's the reasonable West and the unreasonable rest. The true and the false, the sane and the mad, the smart and the stupid, etc. And all this, it is the logocentric tradition, the phallogocentric tradition of white mythology, which is dominant, and consequently women, people of color, sexual and gender minorities, the southern hemisphere, etc., that gets marginalized. This both sounds a lot like Marxism and like the movement that Jordan is reacting to, doesn't it? It's true that something like the oppressor versus oppressed opposition is something that invites deconstruction, but first, in the deconstruction, the terms get reversed, which, again, that's a conceptual analog to the dictatorship of the proletariat, if I've ever seen one, followed with the sort of destabilizing of the binary altogether, or, as you would see in Marx, the end of class altogether. The Marxist dialectic is mirrored in the deconstructive movement, and the aim is ultimately to abolish what is conceived of as a traditional hierarchical domination of one concept or one signifier over another. So while Derrida wouldn't want oppressor versus oppressed to stand as some real description of class antagonism of our society, because it can't ever be so stable and simple to him, that doesn't put him so at odds with Jordan's description as one might think. And as we saw in white mythology, Derrida does seem to think that the traditional narratives have in fact produced these kinds of binary oppositional pairings. He just thinks they don't have ontological validity and should be destabilized. And if we consider the heirs of Derrida in the academy, they're even more Marxist in their reception of this stuff. The way they work, the way they use deconstruction, is basically to grab hold of any conceptual pair and use deconstruction to undermine the perceived privileging of the privileged term, so men, white people, whatever, which is, as we've seen, certainly not super alien to Derrida in the way that he uses deconstruction. And this is what Jordan is talking about. They want to attack hierarchies, seeing them all as invalid. They want to overthrow whatever term happens to have gotten the upper hand anywhere and destabilize our systems of meaning, the concepts and categories that we use to make sense of the world, that are necessary to make sense of the world, even according to Derrida. The explosive proliferation of different genders is an example of this. Surely gender has been deconstructed. The center is gone. There are so many intersex conditions. There's tiny, effeminate men and huge masculine women. There are women that can't have children, can't produce milk. They don't have ovaries. There are men with micropenises. There are hermaphrodites, etc., etc. The two categories then slide into each other, and we get both and neither nor. As for Foucault, his politics is a more difficult matter. He actually belonged to a communist party for a while in the 50s, later decided against it. His relationship to Marx is complex, but again, Jordan doesn't claim that these people are Marxists. He claims that they're neo-Marxists. Foucault being a member of the Communist Party and then later leaving it would be a pretty good clue that he's aiming to modify or correct the worldview of the dogmatic Marxist. To be clear again, though, it doesn't really matter, as it is the reception, the inheritance, the progeny of Foucault today, the way Foucauldianism functions in the political and cultural discourse of the present, that Jordan is really primarily reacting to. But there is a reason that he's used the way he is used today, and we can find this within Foucault's thinking. His major contributions are concepts like genealogy, power, and discourse. He gets genealogy from Nietzsche, so it would be interesting to hear why Jordan would appreciate it when Nietzsche does it, but not when Foucault does it. But again, nobody asks him questions like that. Anyway, these concepts are interconnected. He uses genealogy as a kind of search for radical breaks and origin points in epistemic or discursive history. He wants to unearth and lay bare the bits and pieces in the history of our institutions and ideas that are left out or marginalized by our narratives about those institutions and their development. In so doing, he makes clear the contingent nature of these things. He is a social constructionist, which is one of the main ways that he animates things like gender theory today. So in something like Madness and Civilization, for example, he'll use the genealogical method to make the point that this narrative we have about the fundamentally humanitarian, progressive evolution and purpose of psychiatric therapy and the mental institution neglects so much in this history that suggests otherwise, and that reflects a history of thinking about reason and unreason, the latter being associated with things like joblessness, so that the people who didn't labor would be locked up, etc. His point is that something like madness has no coordinates in the real, it has no ontological validity, but it is knowledge and a set of objects that produced by psychological discourse. We act in daily life like we know what insanity is, and that it's a real thing. But Foucault wants to show that the way that we understand insanity has a long and complex history. It's been defined any number of different ways, and most importantly, how it gets defined has a relationship to power. So like Heidegger, he views the subject as thrown, but thrown into discourse. In fact, subjectivated by discourse. And knowledge isn't out there somewhere, but is a product of discourse. The madman isn't out there existing in the world as a fact, but is called into being by the psychological therapeutic discourse. The insane aren't natural objects, they're discursive objects. A new category of being gets produced, both the object and the knowledge about it. The subject and object both emerge out of the field of discourse. Knowledge is a product of discourse rather than naming some truth out there in the world, i.e., Foucault's also definitely postmodern. He avoids meta-narrative. He rejects any kind of transcendental conception of truth or reality. So if there's no true or false, right or wrong, good or bad, what's he doing? He considers himself primarily a theorist of power, the functioning of power, the micropolitics of power, and the relation between discourse and power. A clear example would be something like criminological discourse. The criminal who is brought into being by criminological discourse. What is the effect? Some people are hurt by it, and some people benefit. Certain kinds of people, maybe poor people, unemployed, or just different, having a different view of the world or a different ethical consciousness, a different form of subjectivity, opting for different forms of life. These people get marginalized or further marginalized by the discourse, whereas the prison builders, the guards, the police, the politicians, who can market themselves as tough on crime, etc., benefit from the discourse. So for Foucault, even if there is no ultimate truth about criminality, ethics, etc., the discourse on these things has effects. It constructs a world for us. That's why he's a social constructionist. The rightness or wrongness of a behavior isn't a fact of nature. It's knowledge produced by a particular discourse with a particular history. So we can see how Derrida and Foucault could be combined together, right? Our concepts have no ontological validity. They aren't stable. There's play. Meaning is deferred. That's how discourse works. We're subjectivated by the discourse. Discourse produces knowledge. Nevertheless, discourse affects power relations. It does this through the construction of traditional conceptual oppositions, one of which in the pair gets privileged and the other one is marginalized. This is necessary for there to be a structure at all, for there to be discursivity. And it's also how power operates. Everything is socially constructed, and its construction is a consequence of and produces power differentials. So use genealogy and or deconstruction in order to undermine and upset the traditional hierarchical order, or to display the contingency and power politics that are involved. Through this process, hopefully you achieve a little more equitable distribution of power, uplift the lower term a bit, diminish the upper term a bit, etc. Not a super terrible goal, really, in theory, in and of itself, sort of noble. And then add critical theory to it, too. The result being that, okay, and there's also this resistance to change in the structure of these discourses or to the overturning of these hierarchies, and that resistance is ideology. This is a product of the culture industry, of the cultural machinery of late-stage consumer capitalism. It's bourgeois false consciousness. So we need to also apply immanent cultural critique in order to attack the symbols and institutions of our society. These serve only to indoctrinate, to enslave, to prevent people from being able to see the contingent arbitrariness of the system that dominates them, prevents them from seeing that other ways of life are possible, etc. And again, I sympathize with a lot of this stuff, but certainly this trifecta can be pretty fairly described as postmodern neo-Marxism. And surely this stuff bears a clear relation to the New Left, to the paradigm dominant in the university and the media in Hollywood and Silicon Valley, at least at the level of rhetoric. And surely we can see how he would suggest that this line of thinking bears some relation to the enemy, to the misery, to the alienation, to the meaninglessness of modern life. And Jordan wants to ask why. He wants to examine more seriously the meaning of our inherited way of life, the function of our institutions, etc. And he wants to argue that these hierarchies may be neither simply arbitrary nor simply a matter of power, that they're unavoidable on the one hand, at least to some degree, and on the other that they might be based on something more like competence, and so are necessary. He wonders whether the social constructionist worldview might not both have deleterious effects on the world and be actually wrong, whether this tripartite academic ideology might be just as unfounded as Derrida, Foucault, and critical theories suggest that our concepts and institutions are. Interestingly, I think that there's a lot in these three schools of thought that might be useful to Jordan's project, but that's for another video, as are my principal criticisms of him. Okay, this video was long, and I'm sorry, but I didn't know how else to really give a general overview in response to this topic. In the future, my videos will be a lot more concise and topically specific. Additionally, I'm working on understanding my tone and audience better. I somehow thought I was being simultaneously way too general and reductionist on the one hand, and way too academic and technical on the other. So clearly I've got to think more about how I want to communicate. And also in the future, I don't anticipate doing much reading of notes, but I had already written quite a bit down from the conversation I had with my anti-Peterson friend I mentioned early on that sent me the article. And I decided to use a lot of what I had already written to him. So for this time, I went ahead like that. But for now, that's all.